So welcome everyone. I'm going to just go ahead and get started since it's about 6 o'clock. Good evening. I'm Lena Rubin, Programming Assistant at Village Preservation. I'm so glad you're all here with us. A bit about Village Preservation. We have been documenting, celebrating, and fighting for the preservation of Greenwich Village, the East Village, and NoHo since 1980. We work to expand and extend landmark and zoning protections and stop inappropriate development, while also encouraging appropriate development in our neighborhoods. We host roughly 75 programs a year, all of which are now virtual and most of which are free and open to the public. Our events are meant to illuminate the cultural and architectural heritage, history, and depth, and the value of preservation in our communities. We're a nonprofit, membership-based organization, so your involvement and support mean the world to us. Learn more at our wonderful new website, villagepreservation.org, and please consider becoming a member or making a donation if you're able at villagepreservation.org/donate. Starting in the 1910s, the National Board of Review of Motion Pictures was located at 85th Avenue in the area south of Union Square, for which Village Preservation is currently seeking landmark protections. We're so grateful to have been connected with our speaker, Jennifer, through our advocacy efforts to gain landmarking and protections for the area south of Union Square. Jennifer was kind enough to write us a letter of support, which is one essential element in showing the city how important, historic, and worth marking this area is, especially given the threats of development and demolition. We're proud to be fighting for this and so many other buildings in this area and in all our neighborhoods. I'm going to put the link in our chat if you're interested in learning more about our preservation efforts for south of Union Square, and we hope that you'll get involved. So just a bit of Zoom protocol. Though I won't be visible during the event, please feel free to use the chat to say hi, tell me where you're joining from, or to raise any issues or thoughts. If you have questions specifically for our speakers, please use the Q&A function, which you can do at any point during the talk, and I'll get to as many of those as possible. And so without further ado, I'm so pleased to introduce tonight's speaker. Jennifer Fronc is a professor of history at the University of Massachusetts-Amherst and the author of 2 books, New York Undercover, Private Surveillance in the Progressive Era, and Monitoring the Movies, The Fight Over Film Censorship in Early 20th Century Urban America. She is a former Big Onion walking tours guide. And again, you can learn more about Village Preservation's work to landmark the National Board of Review of Motion Pictures' former headquarters as part of our South of Union Square effort, due to the civil rights and social justice history of this and many surrounding buildings. Okay, so Jennifer, whenever you're ready, let's get started.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining me this evening. I'll be talking to you a bit about the history of the National Board of Review of Motion Pictures, along with, actually, Lena, I'm going to share my screen now. Thank you. Let's get to my slides here. There we are. So I'm going to talk with you all today about the history of the National Board of Review of Motion Pictures and the cinema and motion picture industry below 14th Street in the early 20th century. So the National Board of Review was located at 75th Avenue for the first couple of decades of its life. Also at 75th Avenue was the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, or the NAACP. Both organizations were founded in 1909 in the heart of what historians refer to as the Progressive Era. The NAACP was devoted to civil rights for Black Americans and launched an important anti-lynching campaign after the film The Birth of a Nation. The National Board was founded in 1909 as kind of a branch or a sub-project of a different organization called the People's Institute. And the National Board's goal from the beginning was to encourage high standards for filmmakers, but also to encourage audience members to seek out higher quality films and to reject that which was sensational or merely exciting. I'm going to talk so much more about all of this. So this is an image looking from the Manhattan Bridge up over the Lower East Side to Union Square. And I wanted to kind of set the stage for what the city was like in the early 20th century. The neighborhood below 14th Street and east of Fifth Avenue was largely just referred to as the Lower East Side. And this was home to several immigrant neighborhoods. There was the German immigrant neighborhood known as Kleine Deutschland around 8th Street and 2nd Avenue. South of there, you have Little Italy, and south of there, the Jewish East Side. Of course, in these, I'll get to the kinetoscope in just a second. Of course, in these neighborhoods, folks lived in tenement apartment buildings. The neighborhood was quite crowded. It was the most densely populated in the United States in the 20th century. And you also had the attention of progressive era social reformers on this neighborhood. So, touching on the history of technology and the history of motion pictures, I'm sure most of you know that Thomas Edison was the pioneer. And with his films, I'm going to show you one of his films in just a second. The early footage that he and his camera operators captured were then fed into what is called a kinetoscope. And the kinetoscope was for one viewer at a time. So on my slide here, the image on the left is a man watching a kinetoscope. On the right is an image of a kinetoscope parlor. So in the late 19th and early 20th century, these kinds of kinetoscope parlors would be smattered around the Lower East Side, and you could come in and catch a small image. So the one that I want to share with all of you was filmed in 1903, and it's titled Emigrants Landing at Ellis Island.
From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
So this is footage of a ferry coming from Lower Manhattan and carrying third class and steerage class immigrants to Ellis Island, where they will undergo screening. So Ellis Island opened in 1892. And between 1892 and about 1917, approximately 12 million immigrants came to the United States. The vast majority of them settled in New York on the Lower East Side. We'll see in just a minute here the people as they disembark. I have to admit that I'm always so moved by this footage. My ancestors came to Ellis Island. I don't know very much about them, but I always imagine maybe they're on this ship. Maybe they are disembarking. So with the Edison kinetoscopes, it wasn't so much about the subject of the film as it was about admiring this technological capacity that we now have. So with the Edison kinetoscopes, it was about the novelty of watching a moving image. So these are the very earliest moving images that are exhibited commercially or publicly in the United States. They don't have a narrative. They are just a slice of life, capturing something quotidian, or interesting or unusual. If you're interested, I would encourage you to check out the Library of Congress website, which has a number of these short Edison films. So this is another one that I wanted to share with all of you. This is also an Edison kinetoscope, filmed in 1903 on the Lower East Side in a pushcart market. I want you to get the sense from watching this of how crowded and busy and animated life on the Lower East Side in public was at the dawn of the 20th century.
From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
If any of you have ever visited the Tenement Museum or gone on a Big Onion walking tour, you have definitely encountered information about the pushcart markets. Now again, these are just slices of life capturing a glimpse on the Lower East Side. Now, this one does have a bit of a narrative arc, but that's an accident because at the end of this footage, the camera catches police officers who are heading toward the pushcart vendors. And it's titled "Move On" because the police are clearing the vendors away. I was saying earlier, if you're interested, the Library of Congress website has a number of these Edison clips. They've also have a number of preserved silent films on their website, if you're a buff like I am. So I'm going to stop this one and go back to my PowerPoint. All right, so back here. Oh my goodness. So what I hope that I was able to convey to you, I'm used to doing this either in a huge lecture room or on a city street. So this is a little different without any direct feedback. So I hope that I conveyed to you that late 19th, early 20th century New York, you have millions of immigrants who are entering the city. The vast majority of them live below 14th Street on the east side. They shop in the pushcart markets. They recreate on the streets as well. And most of them live in tenement apartment buildings. So this image shows you the interior of two tenements. And many of you may live in tenements. I know I did when I was in New York. And you would have about a dozen people living in any one of these apartments. They tended to be crowded. Many tenement dwelling families would incorporate paid work with their home lives. So in these tenement spaces where the family was living, sleeping, eating, perhaps you would also have boarders, people non-related to the family who are living with them. Mothers often did piecework for the garment industry, assembling artificial flowers, rolling cigars. These are all of the kinds of jobs that could happen inside of a tenement building. So if you are, let's say, the 17-year-old son in this family or the 17-year-old daughter in this family, you don't necessarily enjoy spending your off-work time in this crowded, busy apartment. And this is where the joy of the movies would come in. So, switching gears a little bit, this is an image of the Dewey Theater. This used to be located at 126 East 14th Street, and this was the first theater leased by William Fox, the founder of Fox Motion Pictures. Fox doesn't create Fox Motion Pictures until 1915, and he loses his stake in the company in 1930, but he is the one who lent his name to 20th Century Fox, Fox Broadcasting, Fox News, all of that. He got his start here. So the Dewey Theater was initially built as a church, and it was converted into a theater in 1898. When it first opened, its playbill was a combination of vaudeville and burlesque. By about 1905, 1906, 1907, these theaters started to change their bills, and they started to offer vaudeville or burlesque interspersed with a number of motion picture reels. William Fox was really the entrepreneur of this. At the Dewey Theater, all seats were 10 cents all of the time, and it was known as the coolest place in town in the summer because it had a number of fans attached to the ceiling as well as the walls. So if you were living in a crowded tenement, for 10 cents, you could spend 3 to 4 hours at the Dewey Theater, enjoying entertainment and enjoying some air circulation. And that is not to be downplayed. After Fox outgrew the Dewey and decided to invest a bit more, he had the City Theater built for himself in 1909. That was located at 114 East 14th Street, and next door at 112 was the home office of Fox Films. The City Theater was designed by architect Thomas White Lamb, and in the 30s, it was given an Art Deco makeover. So there's a couple of images there. The theater was demolished in the 50s. But this is an interior view of the City Theater. It seated 1,855 people, one screen, one stage. 10 cents every seat. So there's an image of the boxes on the right and a view from the stage. So I've only showed you 2 theaters, but the entire 14th Street corridor was filled with theaters. There was the demolished 14th Street Theater, which then became the Civic Repertory Theater. North of Union Square in the 20s was where the film processing and editing took place. There's just, well, actually that may not be true. I haven't lived in New York in 15 years. I was going to say there are still remnants of that business in the West 20s around 6th Avenue, but I don't know if that's true anymore. All right. Eventually, the business end of the motion picture industry headquartered up in the West 40s. The National Board of Review, as we know, was down at 14th and 5th Avenue, and it used many of these theaters and their screening rooms throughout the early 20th century to exhibit motion pictures to what it called its model audiences. I'm going to come back to that idea in just a second. I want to tell you a bit about the more disreputable theaters of this time period. So we just talked about the larger theaters up on 14th Street, but scattered throughout the side streets on the Lower East Side were smaller theaters. Some were called nickelodeons. Nickelodeons only charged 5 cents a seat. And the nickelodeons didn't necessarily have to be in dedicated theater buildings. Sometimes nickelodeons popped up in storefronts. Sometimes saloon owners would turn their back room into a motion picture exhibition space. And the nickelodeons attracted children, immigrant families, working class young men and women. A nickel was affordable even for the most strapped working girl. So what were folks watching in the Nickelodeons? Well, the Nickelodeons would still show kinetoscope type reels showing off the technological innovations of the age. But they also showed what were called the cinema of attractions. And these are not too different from YouTube videos we might watch now when we're really bored. So Professor Welton's Boxing Cats from 1894 was a really popular reel to show at the Nickelodeons. I have a clip of this.
From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C. This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.
I really love those boxing cats. I really want to know more about Professor Welton and if he was injured when he tried to put those tiny boxing gloves on those cats. But allow me to be serious. The other video I want to show you is called The Kiss, and this was from 1896. Before I show you this, I want to tell you that this again is from the Edison Company. This couple is John, what is his name? It's May Irwin, and I forgot John's name. It's fine. Anyway, they were stage actors in a play called The Widow Jones. And they were asked to recreate the famous kiss from their play for a camera. And a critic said that this kiss shown on stage was beastly enough, but once committed to film, he said that it was absolutely disgusting. So prepare yourselves, folks. It's absolutely disgusting, according to somebody from 1896.
From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C. This has been a presentation.
I would say that maybe that critic was a little sensitive. I don't think it's disgusting or beastly. But what this does go to show you is that disgustingness is in the eye of the beholder, shall we say. I'll come back to this idea in a little bit, but the National Board of Review really believed that there would be individual, local, and regional differences in the way that people reacted to certain kinds of film. So in the early years of motion picture exhibition, somebody running a Nickelodeon or someone like William Fox would string together 6 or 7 of these smaller clips, and then they'd be interspersed with vaudeville performances or perhaps burlesque performances. As time goes on into about 1910, we start to see the emergence of more narrative style film. groups. And yeah, let's take a quick look at another film from the Library of Congress collection. This is a character named Uncle Josh. And Uncle Josh was actually the first series star. There were 3 short films that were made with Uncle Josh. One is called Uncle Josh's Nightmare, one is called Uncle Josh at a Spooky Hotel, and one is Uncle Josh at the Moving Picture Show. And that's the one that we're gonna watch. And we'll talk about that. I'll talk about that.
From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
So Uncle Josh is in this box on the left-hand side of your screen. You can see him peeking at the title card that says Parisian Danger. And he's applauding as this woman is dancing. And now he's climbing out of his box. Oh, Speeding Train movies were very popular as well. Watch out, Uncle Josh. And he's back in his box, safely back in his box. All right. Now this clip, the country couple. This couple is going to be using the well. And at a certain point, Uncle Josh thinks he recognizes this young woman and is concerned that she's canoodling with this man. And he attacks the man and rips the screen down and finds the unsuspecting projectionist, and they fight.
This
I think that's hilarious. That might say more about the amount of time that I've spent with silent film clips. But audience members in 1902, 1905 would have recognized this Uncle Josh character as kind of their rube country cousin, or he's behaving perhaps the way a greenhorn immigrant might behave, not quite understanding how the motion picture exhibition works, ending up with his arms around the projectionist. And what this also says to us is that the experience of movie going was very different than it is now. In this time period, the movies, the Nickelodeon in particular, was really important for immigrant populations. Immigrant mothers sometimes sent their brood of children to the movies and said, like, stay there for the day. So it was daycare in a way. Families would often go to the movies together, maybe on a Sunday, and bring their entire meal with them, consume the meal in the theater. People would also see the same reels over and over and over again in this time period. There just weren't that many in circulation. And so they might know what's happening. And so they'll be like rooting for the heroine and booing the villain. Or rushing the stage as Uncle Josh did. And this kind of behavior flew in the face of middle-class propriety, of the way that middle and upper-class people attended the theater. You did not interact with what was going on, you observed. So all of that kind of came together in this concern about what's going on at the movies. By around 1907, 1908, you get a lot of concern among reformers and some city council members in New York that these small Nickelodeon theaters are fire traps. And in fact, they were a little fire trappy. The film itself was incredibly flammable. There were no real fire codes. People were packed in. In addition to that, some reformers started to raise concerns that adults could be preying on children or young women in these dark theater spaces. And so this reform movement around movies and movie going starts to shape up. The National Board of Review is founded in 1909, and it very much wants to distinguish itself from the kinds of reformers who say movies are bad, movie theaters are bad. The National Board believes that movies can be educational and enlightening, but they are concerned that as movies become more popular, that motion picture producers are going to cater to the lowest common denominator. And what might be surprising is that in the 19-teens, the lowest common denominator was not slapstick comedy, but was instead what were called problem plays, sometimes referred to as sex problem plays. So there's one very famous sex problem play. Let's see here. So in 1913, a film called Traffic in Souls was released. Traffic in Souls was one of these sex problem plays, and we could analogize it to muckraking or expose journalism. So around 1913, there's an enormous amount of fear in New York, in Chicago, that with this huge wave of new immigrants to the United States, that these immigrants were trafficking in women. So it sort of combines this fear of immigrants along with this fear of more and more women working outside of the home. So it's conjuring up this fear that shady and shifty immigrants have invaded our cities and are kidnapping innocent white women and forcing them into brothel prostitution or other kinds of sex slavery. There were a number of investigations into whether or not this problem was true or not. It really wasn't, but the fear and the hysteria was there anyway. So this movie was very earnestly trying to expose a social problem to society. This is another one of those films that has been preserved in part by the Library of Congress. Let me see if okay, what have I done here? Here we are. So this is the trailer for Traffic in Souls. Take a look. So this man with the hat is Bill Bradshaw. He is a nice-mannered procurer of women, and he is hitting on Mary. That's Mary, and that's her sister Lorna. Mary and Lorna are Swedish immigrants who work at a chocolate shop together. And Bill is chatting up Mary, sweet nothings, asking to take her out. Lorna's very concerned. So there was also a concern during this time period. It was sometimes called the wages and sin theory, that working women turned to prostitution and sex work because they were not paid enough at their jobs. And that was a little bit true. All right. So here's Lorna saying, "Oh, Mary, don't be foolish. You don't know him." I don't actually know if that's the dialogue, but it probably is. So the way that this story plays out, and it's very convoluted and kind of strange. So I'll just tell you, I stopped that a little bit early. I'll tell you all that this movie is available in its entirety online if you're interested. So what's interesting about this movie is that you see that Mary does go on a date with Bill. We then see her wake up alone and surprised in what turns out to be a locked room in a brothel. Like the housekeeper comes in, and that's when she realizes that she has been kidnapped. Her sister's boyfriend is a cub reporter who is on the police beat, and he overhears the tips about this story. And he makes it his job to find Mary and spring her from the brothel. But within this whole narrative, they also implicate reformers. The sister gets a job answering phones at something called like the Purity and Reform League, where she realizes that nice ladies and gentlemen, this was aimed at John D. Rockefeller, were actually involved in all of this business. So I bring all of this up because reformers thought that movies like this were making light of this kind of social problem, but they also feared that it would give people ideas. They feared that it would denigrate the reputation of New York and its women and its reformers and its police. But there's another side to this, and that is there were loads of sex problems plays like Traffic in Souls. But what's really interesting for me to think about is how did working women, young working women, view these films? I believe that they probably had alternate viewings or interpretations. I analogize them to the after school specials of my youth in the late 70s and the 80s. There was one in particular where a young Helen Hunt is on drugs and jumps out of a window. And when I was 11, it was hilarious. So I'm imagining that young working women in the 19-teens watched these movies and knew that they were produced by reformers to teach them something, and they thought they were funny. But reformers really thought this is going to drive down the overall quality of the motion picture output in the United States. Let me go back to my PowerPoint. All right. So around the time that we're getting all of these expose movies, there is a mounting legal campaign against motion pictures. And in 1915, the Supreme Court issues a kind of devastating decision for people who argued that the movies are speech and should be protected by the First Amendment. This is the position that our heroes, the National Board of Review, take. So in this Mutual Film Corporation versus the Industrial Commission of Ohio, and I'm not going to get into all of this, but suffice it to say that the Industrial Commission of Ohio was in essence censoring films and issuing licenses for films to be exhibited in Ohio. Mutual Film asserted that this was a prior restraint on speech to have any kind of government licensing. Now, the Supreme Court ruled that motion pictures were not regarded nor intended to be regarded by the Ohio Constitution as parts of the press of this country or as organs of public opinion. Moreover, the court ruled that motion picture exhibition was a business conducted for profit, and therefore it fell outside of First Amendment protections. So this ends up with the Supreme Court essentially affirming the constitutionality of state censorship of motion pictures. By 1916, Ohio, Kansas, Pennsylvania, and Maryland all have state boards of censorship. So that means that there is anywhere from 1 to 5 bureaucrats in these states who are watching motion pictures and deciding what can be exhibited publicly to the residents of their state. New York State had come very close to adopting a state board in 1916, and it was narrowly rejected. New York State does adopt its own board in 1921, and it ends up being a pretty conservative board that the Catholics get a number of seats on a couple of decades after. Now, dozens more states had grassroots social movements for motion picture censorship. And most often, these campaigns were led by club women, middle and upper class women, often educated, often mothers, who were involved in social reform organizations. Many of them, in this moment when women's activism is reaching a crescendo with suffrage and women's rights, these women were arguing that we are mothers, and as mothers, we know best what should be in the movies. Now, this argument infuriated a man named W.D. Maguire, and he was the executive secretary of the National Board of Review. He was so angered by this. He argued that the movies were not for children, right? Maguire, I haven't been able to find a picture of him. I don't know a ton about him. He went to Williams College for undergrad. He went to the Columbia School of Social Work. He was a bit of an Irish nationalist, which is really interesting. But I imagine he was really kind of fiery. He ended up yelling at a meeting of a couple hundred people. Something to the effect of, just because little Mrs. Smith doesn't know how to raise her children, are we supposed to tell producers like D.W. Griffith to present only fairy tales? So this is where the National Board really starts doing its big work. It is fighting against state motion picture censorship. So, two of the organizations of women that were most involved in the battle over censorship were the General Federation of Women's Clubs and the Women's Christian Temperance Union. The WCTU is best known for putting its weight behind the prohibition of alcohol, but it referred to motion picture censorship and its activism on behalf of legal censorship as the second noble experiment, right? Prohibition of alcohol is one. Motion picture censorship was their second noble experiment. The General Federation of Women's Clubs was an organization that didn't have the same unifying idea that the WCTU did. The General Federation of Women's Clubs was really just an umbrella organization. So the women's clubs themselves were associated with individual cities or states, and they could have very different politics. But Maguire of the National Board, no matter if it was the GFWC or the WCTU, he said, seeking their cooperation in the fight against censorship would be like attempting to engage Satan for the distribution of holy water. So Maguire didn't have a lot of time for women who advocated for censorship. And Maguire did have a real soft spot for Griffith. And they had a pretty close working relationship, as we're going to see in a few more slides. So in this time period, 1915, 1916, the National Board of Review, all right, let me back up a little bit. When the organization was founded in 1909, its name was the National Board of Censorship, and it changed its name in 1916 to the National Board of Review because it did not want to be associated with state censorship, legal censorship, government censorship of motion pictures. What the National Board was doing, it called its program one of selection, not censorship. What the National Board did was it had a stable of what it called model audiences. So these model audiences were drawn out of its enormous review committee. And the National Board's review committee had about 400 members in the 19-teens. And what would happen is every motion picture production company that hoped to exhibit its output in the United States voluntarily sent its pre-release reels to the National Board of Review. The National Board of Review then screened those movies to a selected model audience. And McGuire always assured motion picture producers, these are the best people. There were a number of women who would be in these model audiences. They were women that he had connections with in the settlement house movement, women who were in the NAACP, women who were in the General Federation of Women's Clubs, but who shared his political point of view. Now, McGuire's idea was to show every movie to a model audience and then have them fill out a survey blank about the audience. How did you feel about it? Did you like it? Who do you think should watch this movie? Was there anything objectionable? McGuire would then collect all of those surveys and write a recommendation to the producer. If there was anything that a majority of the audience found objectionable, McGuire would recommend that the producers take this out before distribution and exhibition. The New York Public Library just recently digitized a little bit of the National Board of Review's papers. The New York Public Library has the National Board's papers from 1909 to 1971. I spent a lot of time in these papers and they're delightful if you're interested. So this is just an example of the kind of invitation that somebody on a model audience or in the review committee might receive. So this was for a film called Purity. And you'll notice on here it says, note, the photoplay centers about the presentation of Audrey Munson in the nude and raises the question of whether the artistic excellence of such a production warrants the public exhibition of motion pictures of this type. An expression of opinion will be sought Thursday evening at the exhibition. So one of the films that I want to talk about is called A Square Deal. I'm going to talk about this to give you an example of how the National Board attempted to negotiate with producers around certain motion pictures. So A Square Deal, 1917, was a movie about three friends. A Square Deal was put out by the, sorry, I have a cat that's in the sink, was put out by the World Film Corporation in 1917. When this movie showed up in Bridgeport, Connecticut, it had not been cut according to the National Board's recommendations. So what was the matter with this film? Well, it was a story of three friends, Mark, Doris, and Hugh. Mark, a writer, he was newly successful on the literary scene, met and fell in love with a beautiful gold digger named Ruby. Mark was blinded by Ruby's charms, so he marries her, and he only learns of her true nature after their marriage as she begins to make increasingly extravagant purchases as the new Mrs. Mark Dunbar. So Mark's old friend Hugh is really worried about this relationship, and Hugh decides to dress up and pose as a different millionaire, and he seduces the wife and woos her away. Mark ends up divorcing Ruby, and he later recognizes the value of a true friend. What nice things his friend Hugh had done for him, wooing away his gold-digging wife. So the National Board of Review had requested a number of edits from this movie before it could be released. One controversial scene shows Ruby being groomed by her mother, combing her hair, groomed in a different context too, but shows Ruby's mother combing her hair. And the title card that accompanies this scene reads, "For it is a woman's beauty that appeals to men, not her brains." That is what upset the review committee. And so the review committee requested elimination of all title cards in that scene, for the reason that the action at this point in the film, where the mother is dressing the girl, would be quite proper without any subtitle inserted. So throughout my research, I found that the National Board would isolate what seemed to me like small moments like this, right? You can't have the mother saying to the daughter, "For it is a woman's beauty rather than her brains that matter." That was objectionable. They said it's enough to just show the mother preparing the daughter to go out on a date. So within all of this, it doesn't seem like that big of a deal until we start talking about different kinds of content. And this is where it gets a little upsetting. So in 1915, the filmmaker D.W. Griffith releases The Birth of a Nation. This is referred to as his opus. The movie is nearly 3 hours long. When it debuts, it does not show in places like the Dewey Theater on 14th Street. It absolutely does not show in nickelodeons or saloons downtown. Instead, it debuts at a theater in Midtown in New York, a theater that had typically been used for stage plays. And the admission was $2, not 5 or 10 cents. There was a large orchestra that played the music. In some cities, the individual theaters had ushers dressed in gray and blue military uniforms, and women dressed in hoop skirts. So kind of embracing this Civil War chic. It's 1915. It's the 50th anniversary of the end of the Civil War. This is also the time period of the New South and the movement against the lost cause of the Civil War. So this is the time period when across the South, you are seeing Confederate statues going up. Right? They didn't go up in the 1860s or the 1870s. They went up 40 or 50 years later. So in a lot of ways, Griffith's Birth of a Nation is a Confederate monument, a monument to the Confederacy and the old way of life. Hold on one second. We'll come back to Du Bois. I want to show you all this scene from The Birth of a Nation. Okay, just had to catch my place there. Before I show you this scene, I just want to mention very quickly that when the National Board first saw The Birth of a Nation, they thought it was fine. They didn't recommend anything be taken out of it. And in the National Board's standards, which was the document that guided their reviewing principles, they stated that one of the reasons the National Board would not intervene in a film would be around issues of historical accuracy. So the National Board said, we will not recommend changes to enforce historical accuracy, right? So this lets Griffith off the hook. So in his film, it's about, I don't even know what to say. I'm going to show you a clip that shows Flora, little sister of the Southern family. She has gone out for a walk and she gets chased by a man named Gus. Gus is an African-American, but in this film, in Griffith's telling, Gus is a quote unquote renegade Negro who has been emboldened by the Northern carpetbaggers who are down messing around in the South in the period of Reconstruction. So we're gonna watch this clip. It's about 2 minutes long of Flora and Gus. Gus is, of course, a white man in blackface. That's Flora's brother. So we see in that clip of Birth of a Nation that Flora had decided that she would rather leap to her death from a cliff rather than wait to find out what Gus would do to her. Now, one might think that that scene, many other scenes, there's a particularly offensive scene of Black legislatures. A 21st century mind could find so many scenes that would be offensive, so many reasons to suggest that this movie not be released to the public. But this wasn't so cut and dried. W.E.B. Du Bois, one of the founders of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, whose offices are in the same building as the National Board of Review, remember, he wanted this film shut down. He said that a new art was used deliberately to slander and vilify a race. The film was a public menace, not art, but vicious propaganda. We are aware now as then that it is dangerous to limit expression, and yet, without some limitations, civilization could not endure. Mary White Ovington, she was also one of the founders of the NAACP. She was particularly concerned about this movie. She thought that the portrayal of Gus was horrifying. She said that Gus was frightening enough to make a Bostonian on Beacon Hill double lock his door at night. I think that's kind of funny. So we have the National Board of Review and the NAACP are sharing office space in the same building on Fifth Avenue. And the NBR is saying, it's fine, it's no big deal. So what ends up happening is the secretary of the NAACP, a woman named May Childs Nerney, she had been running the nationwide campaign against Birth of a Nation, writing letters, collecting petitions, organizing parades, contacting mayors. She contacts Frederick C. Howe. He is the chairman of the NBR's executive committee, and she's like, look, Fred, I don't know if she really said that, but she appeals to Fred Howe and argues, like, why would your organization let this film go forward? And he agreed with her. He feared that the film would cause race riots in the South and postpone the solution of the race problem. So he ended up overturning the NBR Review Committee's decision, and he said, no, we can't let this film go forward. But Griffith was not going to let that stand. And W.D. Maguire of the NBR was in Griffith's corner. So what ends up happening is the NAACP leans on the mayor of New York City, John Perroy Mitchell, and asks him to get an injunction against the Birth of a Nation, saying you can't show this in New York. It's going to create racial strife and possibly riots and uprisings. Mitchell asked Griffith to remove a few scenes, and then the film was permitted to continue to exhibit. Now, Maguire, for his part, really did not want to see this movie get shut down. So before The Birth of a Nation was sent to Boston to be exhibited, Maguire got in touch with the license commissioner in Boston and said, look, I did you a favor, and I removed 2 title cards that are going to cause a problem in Boston. The title cards that he removed, I don't know if you can see those. He removed one that read, pious Puritans blessed the traffic. And another one that said, having profited from the trade and having no use for slaves themselves, the traders of the 17th century became the abolitionists of the 19th century. So Maguire went in and removed title cards from the film that would exhibit in Boston that might upset people who had abolitionist ancestors. He did not do anything about the commentary that this movie offers on Black Americans. Now, the story is a little bit different in Boston than in New York. As the Boston Globe said, as a racial demonstration, nothing like it has been seen in Boston since before the Civil War. So The Birth of a Nation opened at Boston's Tremont Theater. It was supposed to be edited before it was exhibited to the public, but it wasn't. The exhibitor at the Tremont Theater claimed he hadn't been given enough time to make the cuts. And it's important to remember that at this time period, when you were cutting a movie, you were literally using scissors to remove scenes. The National Board would indicate how many centimeters would be trimmed out and spliced back together. So it gets exhibited in Boston. And William Monroe Trotter, a former collaborator of Du Bois, he ran a Black newspaper in Boston called The Guardian, and he was way more radical than Du Bois. He managed to get tickets for a number of Black people who got into the exhibition of Birth of a Nation, and they threw eggs at the screen and they exploded stink pots because that was the last option left to them. Trotter and the National Equal Rights League of Boston had appealed to the mayor, to the license commissioner, to the exhibitor at the Tremont Theater, and no one would intervene on Black people's behalf. So After the birth of a nation, a number of the more progressive members of the National Board leave. Frederick Howe leaves the National Board and he goes on to become the Commissioner of Immigration at Ellis Island. A man named John Collier, who had been with the People's Institute and the National Board since the beginning, also left. He was quite upset about the birth of a nation, and he ended up moving to New Mexico. He later becomes the Commissioner of Indian Affairs under FDR. For the National Board of Review, a real death blow comes in 1921 when New York State adopts its Motion Picture Commission. At that point, the People's Institute severs its relationship with the National Board of Review, and the National Board of Review becomes its own organization. Then in 1922, McGuire died quite suddenly after having his appendix removed. And he had been the guiding force behind the organization since about 1910. So with his death, that period of the NBR's work has come to an end. In 1922, the motion picture industry bands together and creates the Motion Picture Producers and Distributors of America. They hire Will Hayes, the former postmaster of the United States, to run that show, and he is smart enough to tap Alice Ames Winter from the General Federation of Women's Clubs, and she heads the MPPDA's Committee on Public Relations. He had kind of an open door policy for club women who had concerns about the quality of the movies, and in a lot of ways, this edges the NBR out of this. Sorry, my cat distracted me a little bit. The National Board, moving into the 20s and 30s, continues to produce its really influential publications, exceptional photoplays, and films in review. In 1968, Jack Valenti, who is the president of the MPAA, announces that the MPAA is going to come up with its own rating system. And the reason I've come back around to this 1968 is because Valenti assured the American public that the rating system would have no experts on the board, that the rating system would entirely be influenced by, quote, average American parents. Throw in just a couple more things here. Our current movie rating system is entirely designed around protecting children from certain kinds of content, which is exactly what W.D. McGuire and the early National Board of Review had hoped to avoid. I was a teenage record store employee when the tipper sticker was pioneered in the late 80s. And again, another way to indicate that perhaps art and expression aren't fully unfettered in the United States. If you're interested in what I was talking about, you should definitely read my book. If you're not a reader, this documentary from 2006 by a filmmaker named Kirby Dick called This Film Is Not Yet Rated is a wonderful exploration of the Motion Picture Association of America and its rating program. So that's it from me. I'm going to stop sharing my screen and maybe you've got some questions.
Great. Thank you, Jennifer. That was a really rich, wonderful presentation. So now is the time for folks to, if you have questions, please ask them in the Q&A. I have one question here from Nora, who wants to know what was the length of the sex reformer film?
Traffic in Souls, it's about an hour. Yeah.
And I was wondering myself, actually, the movie about the two Swedish sisters who are working in the chocolate shop, I know you mentioned that there was a link to it. So I'm wondering if you could maybe pass that along and we could share it with our audience, maybe in our follow-up email. Thank you. Great. So thanks, Nora, for that question. Do folks have any other questions? I'll give it a couple of moments. So I see that Jean has asked a question. Hi, Jean. Jean is wondering if, Jennifer, you could talk about the National Legion of Decency.
Oh, I can't actually. That's so embarrassing. The National Legion of Decency is decades after my time period, and they were affiliated with the Catholic Church.
Okay, great. Thank you for that clarification. Oh, great. Thank you for posting that link to Traffic in Souls. Great. Let's see. Elizabeth would like to know, were there any films that were rejected for reasons other than sex, including violence, racism, etc., by the NBR?
Yes, there were so many movies. So what the NBR did is it would sometimes ask for certain title cards or scenes to be removed. It very rarely rejected movies in toto, meaning the entire thing. What I was really surprised about is the National Board, and I talk about this in the book, the National Board was very on the watch for animal cruelty and animal abuse. And that notice that you see in the ending credits of movies today that say that no animals were harmed, you know, in the making or production of this, starts with the National Board. And then the General Federation of Women's Clubs took that on as well. So gambling would get cut out, animal abuse, close-ups of currency or postage stamps. I guess because they thought people could try to counterfeit them that way. It's pretty wild, yeah.
Wow, how interesting. Great, yeah, what a good question. Holly wants to know, when, follow up to your other question, when did Catholics first get involved in censorship of movies? If you know this.
Yeah, so the interesting thing about Catholics is that in the 19-teens and 20s, they would not have been in the mainstream of social and progressive reformers. So it's in like the 30s through the 50s that the Catholics really start to position themselves, you know, in the Legion of Decency, and they get seats on the New York State Board. Some scholars have argued that Catholics used their position on these boards as moral arbiters to also be accepted by mainstream society. Anti-Catholic sentiment is, you know, not that far in our past.
For sure, thank you. So it looks like we have a couple more questions about the NRB. Scott wants to know if the NRB reviewed any other mediums, such as live theater.
They did not. They were entirely concerned about motion pictures.
Okay, thank you.
There's a scholar named Allison Kibler and another one named Andrea Friedman, and they have written about the sort of monitoring and censorship of stage plays and the larger obscenity movement.
Great, thank you. Someone, let's see. Another question is, were there review organizations in parts of the country other than the Northeast?
Yes. Yes, I'm laughing because they were everywhere. And Utah had a very active film censorship movement, but interestingly, the people who were fighting against state censorship were also anti-Mormon. So that a lot of the motion picture censorship politics were very local. So Arizona and Utah I write about Virginia and Alabama, Florida, North Carolina. Yeah, it was nationwide. Actually, it was international. Around this same time period, Norway, Sweden, and Australia, and the UK are starting their own boards of censors.
Great, thank you. Let's see. So Jean has asked another question. Thanks, Jean. She would like to know, this is a good question, and I'm not sure if you touched on this, but how is the NRB funded?
Yeah, so in the beginning, they were funded in part by their parent organization, the People's Institute. But as they get up and running, they were funded in part by charging fees to the production companies whose movies they were going to be reviewing. But they were also a private social reform organization, so they received a lot of donations from their wealthy friends.
Got it.
This was a very well-connected organization.
Sounds like
the book I'm currently writing is in part about the man who was one of their representatives. His name was Reverend Cranston Brenton, and he was a professor at Trinity College in Hartford, Connecticut, and affiliated with St. John the Divine.
Oh.
And he put his wife in an insane asylum when she got involved with the suffrage movement.
Mm-hmm.
And through that, I discovered that a lot of wealthy men put their wives in insane asylums. So stay tuned for that one.
We will. Okay, thanks, Jennifer. We've got, I think, one more question for now, and it's almost 7:20, so I think we'll wrap it up. But the last question is, when did the theaters you profiled close?
Yeah, so those theaters on 14th Street, a couple of them were raised in the 30s. And then in the 50s is when Union Square really, so Union Square gets changed in the 50s. And then it was changed again when I was living there in the late 90s and the early 2000s.
Great. Well, that's a great segue for us to just once again mention our landmarking efforts south of Union Square, which Jennifer was so kind in supporting. And thank you so much, Jennifer. This was a really wonderful presentation. And I really enjoyed it, learned so much.
Thank you so much for having me. This was a blast.
I agree, and I really loved seeing the cats boxing. That was incredible.
Yes. Yes.
The more things change, the more they stay the same.
Honestly, always been about cat videos, hasn't it?
Yeah.
Thanks so much.
All right. Well, thank you, everyone, and have a wonderful evening.
Hi, Emmy. Bye, Emmy. Bye, everyone. Thank you.
Take care.